Good evening and welcome to Tea Talks, the myths, the truths, the untold stories of the Boston Tea Party. My name is Kelly Haran Galanti and I am on the creative team here at the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum. In honor of Women's History Month, tonight's topic is Remember the Ladies, the Women of the American Revolution. And tonight we will discuss the contributions and sacrifices made by the Daughters of Liberty during America's struggle for independence. And tonight, I am joined by my friend and colleague, Kristen Harris, another member of the creative team. Kristen, welcome to your very first Tea Talk.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here for this one.
Yes, I am thrilled to have you here. So, tonight, we will have quite the task ahead of us. But let's just say that there is no way that we'll be able to cover everything concerning women in the American Revolution. And so tonight, we'll be focusing our efforts around Boston and, not surprisingly, around the Boston Tea Party.
We really could do a spin-off series where we just focus on the contributions of women alone during the
That's right.
revolution. But for now, just to get started, I suppose we should start with the origins of Women's History Month.
All right.
Yes. So Women's History Month began as a national celebration in 1981 when Congress passed Public Law 97-28, which authorized and requested that the president proclaim the week beginning March 7th, 1982 as Women's History Week. Throughout the next 5 years, Congress continued to pass joint resolutions designating a week in March as Women's History Week. And in 1987, after being petitioned by the National Women's History Project, Congress passed Public Law 100-9, which designated the month of March 1987 as Women's History Month. Since 1995, presidents have issued a series of annual proclamations designating the month of March as Women's History Month. These proclamations celebrate the contributions women have made to the United States and recognize the specific achievements women have made over the course of American history in a variety of fields.
But of course, every month can be Women's History Month if you're doing it right. Now,
True.
one of the greatest difficulties that we find when doing research in the colonial era is the dearth of primary source material written about women, much less written by women. The likelihood of available information decreases when you begin to look at women who were not white or upper class. Historians certainly have their work cut out for them in unearthing any information regarding enslaved peoples, indigenous peoples, middling or lower classes, and truly anyone that was not able to write down and preserve their own story. Now, sometimes all we get is a name, and even then, it might be misspelled or misstated. A woman's name would be included in a marriage record and perhaps in her husband's death notice if she were still living at the time, or if there were a death notice of her own. Now, in creating our 18th century personas here at the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum, we often need to look at existing materials for several different women and surmise what life would have been like for women in similar financial and familial backgrounds. It is rare that we'd have letters or diaries remaining, but for those that we do, it's a fascinating look into 18th century life.
Yeah. And in fact, two Massachusetts natives, Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis
Mhm.
Warren, are among those women who have left behind a treasure trove of letters and writings of the time. So tonight's presentation was named Remember the Ladies in honor of Abigail's now famous letter to her husband John from March 31st, 1776, in which she made the case for the new code of laws that he was involved in crafting to include greater liberties and freedoms for women. And she specifically says, do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could.
Mm.
And though John supported his wife and her continued education and ambition and often sought her counsel regarding politics, he actually brushed off these requests with some teasing language, calling her saucy at one point, but adding, depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know that they are little more than theory.
Ooh, well, I mean, Abigail was saucy, which is why reading her letters is such a joy. Now, she often said to John that her pen was freer than her tongue, which I think we can all relate to.
Oh, yes, I am immediately thinking of social media.
Oh my gosh. Could you imagine if John Adams had Twitter?
I don't think there would be any way that John Adams could fit his diatribes
No.
into 280 characters.
No way, indeed. Now, prior to her famous Remember the Lady's letter, Abigail found herself raising their children alone and dealing with all aspects of the family farm. You see, John's selection as a delegate to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia took him away from Massachusetts in August of 1774. Abigail's letters throughout the next 2 years include the anxieties of the unrest and ultimately the arrival of war in her colony. Her letter to John in June of 1775 describes the death of Dr. Joseph Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill and the roar of the cannon. She had family and friends in the area supporting her throughout this time, but she still missed the presence of her dearest friend. Throughout their 54-year marriage, the two of them spent a great deal of time apart due to John's work as a lawyer in Boston and his political work, which took him to Philadelphia, Washington, and overseas. His absence left Abigail to manage the finances and the household, and this was not uncommon for women in the 18th century.
No, no. And in fact, women in the 18th century actually had many responsibilities and activities contributing to their families, their communities, their everyday life. But it really also depended on where they lived, what their husbands did, how much money they had, and to what ethnic or social groups they may have belonged.
Mhm.
In general, all the housework was completed by women or anyone under their purview, which included indentured servants, enslaved peoples, older female children, etc. This includes procuring of food items and the preparation and cooking of all meals.
Mm.
And that may seem like a relatively easy task, but cooking over a fire in the way that it was done all year long in any weather,
Mm.
it certainly doesn't sound fun unless you have a nice kitchen to do so in. You are also keeping the house clean, whatever that may entail, constantly mending clothes, possibly sewing new clothes, unless you have the means to purchase things from your local merchant. Um, all of this by hand, remember. The first sewing machine actually wasn't introduced until 1830. So when we were banding together to participate in the non-importation and non-consumption agreements in 1767, we needed to find replacement fabric for the boycotted items. So homespun cloth was being utilized by many in the colonies, but it needed to be created first, sometimes in settings known as spinning bees. Women could also make money spinning yarn or taking in others' washing as a means to bolster the family purse. The mass production of fabric was difficult and the labor was intensive, so homespun cloth was mainly reserved for family members and not necessarily for commercial sale.
Now, Kristen, you are an amazing seamstress and you sew your own colonial clothing by hand. But could you imagine if you also had to make the fabric first?
No, I wouldn't do it. Even if I learned how, I don't think I want to. I'm very lucky to have learned how to sew a la 18th century, but I think making the fabric is where I draw a hard line.
All right.
It takes long enough to even sew the garment. But speaking of spinning bees, if we're getting back to making fabric,
Mm.
there was an article published in the Boston Gazette, February 26, 1770. And it says, one day last week, a number of patriot ladies met at the house of John Gore, Esquire of this town, when their industry at the spinning wheel was at least equal to any instance recorded in our paper. It is principally owing to the indefatigable pains of Mr. William Molyneux, and it will be said to his lasting honor that the laudable practice of spinning is almost universally in vogue among the female children of the town, whereby they are not only useful to the community, but the poorer sort are able in some measure to assist their parents in getting a livelihood. The use of the spinning wheel is no encouraged, and the pernicious practice of tea drinking equally discountenanced by all the ladies of this town, excepting those whose husbands are Tories and friends to the American Revenue Acts, and a few ladies who are Tories themselves. So my 18th century persona that I portray at the museum, Frances Gore Crafts, was most likely in attendance since this was held at her father's house. And many people may not realize it, but women had a lot of power as the main buyers for the home. And as they asserted that power, it was definitely during the non-importation and non-consumption agreements that you mentioned, following the enforcement of the Townshend Acts of 1767. A listing from October 28th, 1767 lists many things that will be included in this boycott, such as loaf sugar, men's and women's hats, and ready-made apparel, shoes, buttons, women's and children's stays, many kinds of fabric, furniture, clocks, amongst other things.
Mhm.
Americans have also been persuaded to find local substitutes for their British tea. In choosing not to buy or sell these British goods, suitable replacements would then need to be found, and it often fell to women to do so.
That's right. Following the non importation and non consumption agreements, the women of colonial America were looking for more patriotic ways to fill up their teapots. Because, of course, at this point, we weren't outright boycotting the tea, but we were looking for something here. So petitions for signatures and anti tea pledges were being circulated as well. Women began to search their orchards and gardens for suitable herbs and botanicals with which to create liberty teas. Popular items included raspberry leaves, spearmint or peppermint, orange bergamot, chamomile, bark from sassafras and willow trees. And after the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766, we begin to see the No Stamp Act teapots in the American market. These teapots symbolize the meeting of home and public life. Tea and tea drinking was very important in the American colonies, but it is often overshadowed by the politics of the time. And of course, if you have any interest in learning more about Liberty Teas, you should check out our tea talk from September when I had the pleasure of sitting down with our museum's tea master and the proprietor of Elmwood Inn Fine Teas in Danville, Kentucky, Bruce Richardson.
Yeah, Bruce is pretty great. And so is his
Mhm.
book too. And speaking of more of these amazing articles in regards to tea, there's another one from the Boston Post Boy from November 16th, 1767. Um, and it was sort of one of those examples of how the ladies being recognized for controlling the finances and controlling buying in the home is sort of weaponized by the Sons of Liberty.
Mm.
And the address to the ladies was actually a poem that encouraged women to refrain from purchasing imported goods in favor of wearing, as it says, clothes of your own make and spin. So back to those spinning bees. And actually to substitute Labrador tea, which comes from a species of rhododendron plant that is indigenous to North America, for hyson and bohea. And this poet even went so far as to give marriage and relationship advice, stating that ladies should agree that you'll not marry be to such as will wear London factory.
Ooh.
So what these advertisements continue to do is position women as the main consumers in the
Mhm.
household and controlling that environment.
Absolutely. And, back to that same Boston Gazette, February 26th, 1770 edition that you mentioned earlier, there's a small letter in there that appears, Messieurs Eads and Gill, you may with confidence assure your female readers that a number of the principal ladies in Connecticut have wholly discarded foreign tea till the revenue acts are repealed and others are coming into the patriotic measure. It is to be hoped in a few weeks the consumptions of the pernicious plant will be totally annihilated. In the stead of bohea, they adopt thyme tea, which may be advisable to the ladies of the town of Boston, it being very salubrious and agreeable to the taste of most persons, and to be had in the garden of most every gentleman. If not, it is easily procured and cultivated.
Oh. And that particular edition of the Gazette contains so much relevant information.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a short list of merchants continuing to sell British goods throughout the non-importation agreement, which I'll get a little bit into a little later on, but it also includes two women. Loyalist Cummings sisters here in town, Aim and Elizabeth Cummings. And they operated a shop in Cornhill, and they were known for importing fashions from London. And they sold things like silk and sewing notions, hats. Both of their parents died when they were young, so they were in their 20s. They opened their own shop in 1765. They ended up in a bit of hot water during the non-importation agreements when it's found out that they had imported a ton of fabric from London despite the agreements. So, as is Boston fashion, some people from the Merchants Committee went and knocked on their door asking them why they had not adhered to it, and they actually defended themselves, saying that they had made no such agreement to do so. This was their one and only warning before violent attacks might darken their door, as we see in Boston. And even though they were making things that probably would have made them quite a bit of money, they were still a small business. They were considered small for the time. So for them, adhering to these non-importation agreements is difficult. It would have ruined them. And we see this for many in town. Well, not many, but enough people that it's advertised. And this is the difficulty that people are seeing who are trying to make ends meet that didn't sway with that popular tide. And often, like the Cummings sisters, they'd be warned out or at the very least informed upon as gossip spread. In the case of the Cummings sisters, on March 19th, 1770, it was voted at a town meeting that they, along with 9 others, be entered on the records of this town, that posterity may know who those persons that preferred their little private advantage to the common interest of all the colonies, who not only deserted but opposed their country in a struggle for the rights of the Constitution.
Mm.
Yikes. So after that, the Cummings sisters actually retreated to their small property in
Yeah,
Concord.
yeah, I could see why. But I really got to tell you, I am a huge fan of reading these old newspapers. It is such a great window into 18th century life, and it at least helps me to put into perspective a time that I will never fully understand.
That's very true, and sort of gives us an eye into the level of responsibility that
Mm,
existed among the populace, which is very different from our lives.
yeah.
And just in the language, you can see how much that meant to literally every person involved in Boston society.
Hmm.
And living on a plot of land in the countryside, however, means more responsibilities, because while all these things were happening in Boston town, there were also the people living out in the country that are
That's right.
affected by this. Shops were not easily accessible as in the city, so many families tended gardens for their food, both small and large. Samuel Osgood actually wrote to John Adams in 1775 saying, "A farmer, sir, if he does his duty, finds very little leisure in the winter,
Mm.
because wood always needed chopping, fences, especially for farms with animals, always needed mending, manure needed shoveling, animals needed attending. So children and adults alike were expected to help in tending to these tasks, which seem to be divided not on the basis of gendered expectations, but by strength, height, and ability." Tasks were also very seasonal. So in the spring and summer, there would be planting. Fall was the time for harvesting. And in the winter, there are key survival jobs like food preservation. So salting, pickling, smoking, drying, candle and soap making, and wood hauling. And while they're tending to the gardens, the grounds, the animals, they're also tending to their own children, many of the women who were helping
Mhm.
keep these farms afloat. And we know that Abigail Adams was one of these women who found herself looking after the family farm when John went to the various congresses in Philadelphia over time and was
Mhm.
away for long stretches as the war
Yeah.
broke out. And with the lack of birth control, many women also found themselves in an almost constant state of pregnancy if they were able to conceive.
Mhm.
Complication during childbirth is one of the most common causes of death for women in the 18th century. It was also not uncommon for children to die as infants or very young due to poor healthcare and disease. And we know that Boston, in particular, suffered from 2 major outbreaks of
Mhm.
smallpox, as we get a little in our more recent to 1773
Mhm.
history. Um, but packed in cities where disease could spread faster, of course, that's a little bit of a different problem. We have our own host of problems during this time. Those that didn't survive, or that did survive, excuse me, were primarily educated at home by their
Mhm.
mothers during childhood, and children were expected there too to help with chores and domestic household tasks. So playtime was limited.
Mhm. Now, in general, mothers were expected to teach their children to read using the English practice of hornbook, primer, psalter, testament, and Bible. A formalized education was usually reserved for white men, although some white women of means benefited from the use of family tutors. Mercy Otis Warren is an excellent example of this. She was the sister of Revolutionary firebrand James Otis Jr., and her father permitted her to sit in on the lessons provided by Reverend Jonathan Russell, who was preparing James and another brother, Joseph, for college. Mercy was a voracious reader and wanted to learn as much as she could, excuse me. Her zeal for education certainly broke from the traditional gender roles of the time, but her father clearly supported her endeavors, and her brother James treated her as an intellectual equal and confidant. Mercy went on to correspond with many political leaders, including Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and John Adams, who would go on to become her literary mentor. She published political poems and plays, the first collection of such coming in 1790, entitled Poems, Dramatic and Miscellaneous. And Alexander Hamilton once marked that in the case of Mercy Otis Warren, in the career of dramatic composition at least, female genius in the United States has outstripped the male. Now, Boston had a female literacy rate of 68%, which is fairly high for the American colonies. Historians often get their numbers from the ability of women to sign legal documents, such as wills, deeds, etc., and not from their ability to comprehend what is written. Therefore, while the percentage of women who could sign their name on legal documents is roughly 46% in 1790, it is likely that this number represents the minimum number of people who were literate. English colonists saw a need, of course, to civilize the indigenous peoples, the Native Americans, and gave many of them the opportunity at an English education. But this same attitude was not present in the American South, where many colonies made it illegal for the enslaved to read or write for fear of disobedience and a threat to local security, in addition to being a threat to the overall slave system. Reading was encouraged out of religious motives, but writing instruction was of a more practical nature. Good penmanship was essential in the life of a merchant, a lawyer, or other such skilled professions. Men were also encouraged to write in many hands, which included a business hand that was easy to read and quick to write. Women would be taught to write in private settings alongside needlework and musical ability, and those in the upper classes may have also been taught etiquette, manners, hosting guests, and dancing, while lower class women would be taught more practical skills such as soap and candle making. Well, during the late 1700s, it was common for young women to learn literacy at dame schools. A designated female teacher would take girls into her home to learn the basics of reading, fine writing, and housewifely labors such as cooking and needlework. They also might learn Greek, Latin, French, or other classic languages. Now, these were private ventures and a way for literate women to make money. If a woman was taking in poor children, they could get paid by the town. Now, Anna Green Winslow, a wealthy and industrious young Boston girl in the 1770s, taught us that physical pain or disability is no excuse for slothfulness. She attended finishing schools up until the siege of Boston. Now, wealthier families could afford to privately tutor their children, a privilege the lower classes could not afford. Now, in 1771, the Massachusetts Poor Laws were amended to stipulate that males would be taught to read, write, and cipher, and females in reading and writing, if they shall be capable. In prior iterations of the law, 1710 and 1741 respectively, it was stated that women should be educated to read only. This was commonplace for women of diverse economic backgrounds until the age of 18 or marriage. These laws were meant to cultivate a society of people who actively contributed to the betterment of the colony.
And that's so amazing because when you look at these things, there are a lot of limitations on women,
Mhm.
certainly in this time period. However, it is very clear in reading a lot of these things that they do have a certain power within society and to help the betterment of society. And people are definitely paying attention to that. And the women are sort of using that to their advantage as well, that they can be a part of that society. And so yeah, it's just really interesting to sort of hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, of course, some women would find work outside of the home, perhaps in the family business, in which they would most likely learn some numbers and writing skills. Now, there are many examples of widows taking over merchant businesses after the death of their husbands. Other professions held by women could include apothecaries, barbers, blacksmiths, sextons, printers, tavern keepers, midwives, and laundresses. We know a few of those here in our colonial Boston, don't we?
We do indeed.
In the latter part of the 1770s, women accounted for 11% of the total wage observations, a dip from the time around the French and Indian War, which was 15%, but a significant increase from the middle of the century at 6%. During the latter part of the century, wages began to rise, signaling a departure among women from being employed by their families. Especially with the shortage of a male workforce during the French and Indian War, the numbers of women working in tailoring, weaving, and other occupations rose. Now, some of those occupations included milliners, mantua makers or skilled dressmakers, seamstresses, shopkeepers, often grocers or dry goods, tavern and coffee house keepers, jailers, servants, laundresses, schoolmistresses, midwives, oyster sellers, and boarding house keepers. Now, a few, like the savvy Elizabeth Murray Smith Inman, became highly successful businesswomen or she merchants. Many others ran the business of deceased or absent husbands, like the printer Margaret Green Draper. She, in fact, took over the newspaper business for the Massachusetts Gazette and the Boston Newsletter that her and her husband Richard owned. And we know that she had some scathing words for the radical movement fomenting in Boston. And in fact, that paper started to lean even more to the Loyalist side after she took it over in 1774. And we know of her that she was with the contingent of Loyalists who left Boston after the siege and went to Nova Scotia. And as a result of that loss of business, she actually petitioned the British government for a pension.
Good for her.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the lowest end, women could be used to do domestic or farm labor, but even in manual labor, women made significantly less than their male counterparts. During the period from 1765 to 1774, men working on the farm made 16.7 pennies per day, and females made roughly 7.1 pennies for similar work.
Ooh. And while Boston's economy did not depend on the enslaved population to the degree that many of their southern colonial counterparts who had plantations did, there still were plenty of enslaved people who lived in Boston as well. And in many cases, African people were purchased or inherited as personal servants for families. The diversified New England economy allowed freed Blacks the ability to participate in a variety of occupations, such as domestic servants, farming, skilled and unskilled labor, maritime trades, innkeeping, catering, and other small industries. The daily life of enslaved people, as well as anyone who was not white, was controlled through legislation. A 1703 law forbade Blacks, Native Americans, and mulattoes from venturing out after 9 p.m., as it quotes that law there, unless they were on a master's errand. There were other laws governing curfews, marriage, shopping, ownership of livestock, travel, and trade. One name that you might recognize is that of Phillis Wheatley, who was born in West Africa about 1753. She was kidnapped and brought to Boston aboard the ship Phyllis, for which she was named on the 11th of July, 1761. And the Wheatley family purchased her from the enslaver John Avery. She was a frail child between 7 and 8 years old, and she was chosen to be a domestic servant and companion to Mrs. Wheatley in her later years. Although she spoke no English on her arrival to this country, she soon proved to be a fast learner, and the family decided that she was to be tutored by the Wheatley's daughter Mary in English, Latin, history, geography, religion, and the Bible. Phyllis's first and only published book of poems on various subjects, religious and moral, was published in London in late 1773. She had traveled to London to find a publisher, as no one in Boston wanted to publish her book. The first editions of this book arrived in Boston on November the 28th, 1773, aboard the ship Dartmouth, alongside the East India Company tea. Prior to the arrival of her books, Phyllis writes to David Worcester on October the 18th, 1773, "I expect my books, which are published in London in Captain Hall," which means in Captain Hall's ship, "who will be here, I believe, in 8 or 10 days. I beg the favor that you would honor the enclosed proposals and use your interest with gentlemen and ladies of your acquaintance to subscribe also. For the more subscribers there are, the more it will be for my advantage, as I am to have half the sale of the books. This I am the more solicitous for, as I am now upon my own footing, and whatever I get by, this is entirely mine." Her life, though it is worthy to note, is considered atypical for someone who was enslaved. Her education is that of a young woman in an elite Boston family, so it's much different from many in her position. She was particularly well acquainted with the classics and the Bible and contemporary works, especially those of Alexander Pope. These influences are readily apparent in her writing. However, despite her education, she was also still bound to her enslavement by domestic duties. As written in the foreword of her book, many Bostonians had trouble believing that an enslaved person had written such incredible things. While in England, Phyllis was seen as a bit of a celebrity, meeting diplomats such as Sir Brooke Watson, John Thornton, and Benjamin Franklin. And after Phyllis's return from England, the Wheatley family freed her, so she was manumitted. Phyllis Wheatley would see the success of her book as copies were sold in Boston and throughout the northern colonies, and within a year, her book would be sold as far as New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Nova Scotia.
That's right. Now, a little side note here, Kristen. Sir Brooke Watson was a member of the original committee of the Corporation of Lloyds of London, which we still hear of today. He became the mayor of London in 1796, but he was perhaps most famous for being the subject of John Singleton Copley's large-scale work, and one of my most favorite paintings of all time, Watson and the Shark. But I will save the rest of that story, and I want you to come back and listen to our Tea Talk presentation in May on Mr. Copley himself.
Oh my goodness. I hope
I
you
know.
get plenty
Yes.
of time to talk about Watson.
Yes, and in fact, I do believe we're going to be revisiting Phyllis's story later on in 2021, so be sure to keep an eye out for that as well. Now, it is important to remember that in the 18th century, women had no defined legal identity as an individual. In the case of white women, they were a daughter until they became a wife or they ended up in spinsterhood. Colonial laws put women into two different classes, femme sole, which was a single woman, or femme couvert, married. These were known as coverture laws and strictly defined what women could and couldn't do, legally speaking. Under these laws, married women did not have a legal existence separate from her husband. Now, widows fell into their own category and had specific rights to 1/3 of their husband's estate and any property they brought into the marriage, called dower rights. Now, they often served as executors for their husband's estates. Second marriages were not uncommon, and widows, of course, faced social and economic pressure to remarry. The choice of a husband was very important since divorce was difficult and rare. The only known cases for divorce in Massachusetts were due to adultery, cruelty, or desertion. Between 1692 and 1785, so almost 100 years, the Massachusetts General Court heard 229 petitions for divorce. 101 of those were from men, and they granted 143 of them.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, while parents expected to be consulted and offered advice or criticism freely, men and women chose their own marriage partners. Now, their parents usually accepted their children's choices and could control their children's ability to marry before the age of 21. Now, those who disliked their children's choices might withhold permission, or if the children were of age, leave them out of a will. But this did not happen often. Now, young people rarely courted far from their social class, and they respected parental opinions most of the time. Marriage for women was a complete life change. It meant leaving childhood behind, taking on adult responsibilities, and forming a new family. These new familial bonds may have been tested due to the politics of the time, as many people found themselves on opposing sides from their parents or siblings. Many of the women in Boston took up the mantle of patriotic cause in support of the Sons of Liberty's goals with the organization of the Daughters of Liberty. Their participation in the previously mentioned non-importation, non-consumption agreements and desire to create a better world for themselves and their children show us that women were just as invested in their political futures as the men. Now, that being said, due to the gender norms of the 18th century, women would not have participated in dangerous things, such as the actual destruction of the tea, which is now known as the Boston Tea Party, which took place on December 16th, 1773. Because this situation had the potential to become very violent, and it's just unlikely that they would have been physically present aboard the ships. It is more likely that women were included in the crowds watching from the shore. However, we have no distinct proof of anyone that happened to be present on the wharf that night.
No, but we do have many accounts from women who had a
Mhm.
lot of opinions about what happened
That's
that
right.
night. And I'm sure Frances was probably awaiting Thomas as well.
Mhm.
But Sally Hughes, of some of the accounts transcribed, was the wife of George Robert Twelves Hughes, who was a laundress. So, as we mentioned earlier, we know she was a
Mhm.
laundress to make ends meet. George Robert Twelves Hughes was a shoemaker. She questioned him on his arrival home about his ability to bring her any of the tea, basically saying to him, "Well, George, did you bring me home a lot of it?" And during the port bill, when Boston is closed, we know that she actually walks all the way to her family's home in Weymouth with her children because of the decline of the port. So,
Wow.
again, women very invested in that night and someone directly affected by the outcome of that.
Mhm.
Another woman, Margaret Gamble, Margaret Gamble's youngest daughter, Sarah. Margaret Gamble is married to John Gamble, who is participating in the destruction of the tea. And her youngest daughter, Sarah, wrote, I heard mother tell of her anxiety on that night and how she went home to her mother's to await the return of her husband on that dreadful night. And they knew not if any would return alive, but they did. And then we have another woman, Mahitable Crane, who I always love to think of because she is the husband to John Crane, who becomes very well known in Boston and in military during the Revolution. And he is the only person injured during the night of the destruction of the tea. He does make it out alive, however. But all of that debacle happened on their 7th wedding anniversary. So the destruction of the tea, John getting clocked in the head and making his way home eventually.
Yeah, I guess he may have had a good excuse, about forgetting their anniversary that evening. Um, Someone else that was waiting for her husband was one Lucy Rhoda Wheeler. She was waiting for her husband Josiah, and so when he returned home, he took off his boots and some tea had fallen onto the floor. Now, Rhoda had a female neighbor that had come over to keep her company while Josiah was out, and the female neighbor sees this tea on the floor and she exclaims, "Save it! It will make a nice mess." But Rhoda, being the patriotic woman that she was, she took down her broom, she swept it all into the fire, saying, "Don't touch the cursed stuff." Betsy Hunt Palmer was sitting by the fire awaiting the return of her husband Joseph from the tea destruction. Now, her account is included in Francis Drake's Tea Leaves, and it reads, "One evening, about 10 o'clock, hearing the gate and door open, I opened the parlor door, and there stood 3 stout-looking Indians. I screamed and should have fainted, but recognized my husband's voice, saying, 'Don't be frightened, Betty, it is I. We have only been making a little salt water tea.' His 2 companions were James Foster Condie and Stephen Bruce. Now, soon after this, Secretary Flucker, who was Henry Knox's future father-in-law, called upon my husband and said to him, 'Joe, you are so obnoxious to the British government that you had better leave town.' Accordingly, we left town and went to live in part of my father's house in Watertown." Yeah, Betsy's pretty great. She has quite a story, especially after the Tea Party. Things really get going for her.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
but of course, I can't go anywhere tonight without giving due to my 18th century persona, Sarah Bradley Fulton, who is known as the mother of the Boston Tea Party. Now, according to the Medford Historical Society here in Medford, Massachusetts, on December 16th, 1773, Sarah and her sister-in-law, Anne, awaited the return of Sarah's husband, John, and 4 of her brothers at her brother Nathaniel's home on the corner of Hollis and Tremont Street in downtown Boston, which is today the Theater District. So she and Anne prepped a copper cauldron of hot water to help remove any lampblack or soot, which was used to disguise their features, and quickly ushered them to bed upon returning, as to avoid being seen awake by any passers-by. Now, Sarah found herself involved in many dangerous activities throughout the years of the American Revolution, including helping to tend to the wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill. There's an anecdote that has her rescuing her oxen and a load of firewood from a group of British regulars that were attempting to make off with it, that she just sort of, went and like grabbed onto the reins and were pulling the oxen away. Yeah, she was not having that at all.
Good for her.
And yeah, I know. And she also apparently sewed sensitive information into her petticoats and crossed enemy lines into Charlestown to deliver news to General George Washington. Now, I know people say, "Oh, there's no way that would happen." But Mount Vernon owns a punch bowl that is said to have been owned by Sarah Bradley Fulton, from which she served General Washington when he visited her Medford home to thank her for her service. So she lived, and I mean, all of that just seems crazy, but she lived a very long life. She lived to the age of 94, which is almost unheard of in that time frame. And the Daughters of the American Revolution chapter in Medford is actually named for her. And this chapter was responsible for saving the Royal House and Slave Quarters in 1898 for the sake of its history and aesthetic value. And as per their website, in the 18th century, the Royal House and Slave Quarters was home to the largest slave-holding family in Massachusetts and the enslaved Africans who made their lavish way of life possible. Today, the Royal House and Slave Quarters is a museum whose architecture, household items, archaeological artifacts, and programs bear witness to intertwined stories of wealth and bondage set against the backdrop of America's quest for independence. Now, the Mansion House on those grounds has a room named for Sarah Bradley Fulton and this DAR chapter. And I mean, I have to say, this is one of, if not the most important place for you to visit in our area. And we hope that once the restrictions and guidelines are lifted here, that you'll head over to Medford, Massachusetts and visit the Royal House and Slave Quarters.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fabulous place, and I know that even we have used some of their guidance and how we portray the histories of enslaved persons in Boston as well. They're incredible.
Absolutely. And Sarah's story and her family's involvement in the Boston Tea Party and other events in this time period is told mostly through family lore, which is difficult. There's not a lot of physical primary source material for Sarah, but with the continued work of the Medford Historical Society, hopefully they will get their hands on some more things and we'll learn more about her story. But Kristen, you have a much easier time of finding some source material about Frances. So why don't you tell us about her?
Yes. Well, unfortunately, she does not have the long and fulfilling life of Sarah Bradley Fulton. Frances passes away at the age of 44. But when you sort of look at the scope of her life and everything that was weighing on her, I'm actually not surprised. However, she's from that, elite class of Boston. There's lots of records of her family. They were highly involved in lots of the galvanizing issues here in Boston. And that's sort of what intrigued me to choose her as a character. She is the eldest child of Captain John Gore Esquire, who was for a time a captain in the Ancient and Honorable Artillery. And her mother was Frances Pinckney Gore. The Gores lived sort of near King Street, where John Gore operated his business, the Painter's Arms. He was a well-known person in local politics who had sort of worked his way up to gentility, and also served as an overseer for the poor at the time, which all are basically sort of right under a lot of people on the General Assembly as far as respect. So he's very involved. She marries Thomas Crafts Jr., who is a decorative painter and japanner from the North End, and he's a member of the Loyal Nine, who organized several public protests prior to 1773, especially during the Stamp Act of 1765. So John Gore, her father, is a japanner. He specialized in heraldic painting and carriage painting, we know, and from a lot of evidence, we know that he and his sons actually had a receipt for painting Lydia Hancock's carriage. So they clearly have a very upper class clientele. Yep. This is sort of the environment that Frances was in. His sons, John Gore Jr. and Samuel Gore, are poised to apprentice and take up that business. And we know that during the non-importation agreements, the Gores depended on painters' colors from England for their business. In fact, they were still importing some paint, advertised as being from London during the era of the Townshend Acts. So in an advertisement for some of their painters' colors, they actually made sure to differentiate that the goods they were selling were imported prior to the non-importation agreement. Wow. Because as we know, rumors spread fast in Boston. We saw what happened to the Cummings sisters. The Gores do not want that to happen to them. But in 1767, they had a little bit of an embarrassing moment when an article appeared in the Boston Chronicle containing information from documents from some people who had supported the non-importation agreements were still importing goods. Some of these were on the ship Thomas, ironic, that brought 18 casks of painter's colors for J.G. So no surprise that in 1768 and 69, the Gores are very careful to differentiate. John Gore Jr. owned a little shop across from the Liberty Tree. And after that little episode, even he was very particular about including that his goods were of North American manufacture. For Frances, though, we know that, I think the family was sort of trying to make up for that little blunder over the years and having that spinning bee, she's an elite person in society. So it's good for her to make show of doing that. Mm-hmm. She marries Thomas in 1763. I didn't mention the year before, but J.L. Bell, who's a historian, posits that Frances and Thomas may have met because Thomas may have been apprenticed to John Gore at one time. And I can sort of see that because of the decorative painting. We know Thomas Kraft Sr. was a carpenter, so that's a pretty big departure from house painting and carpentry to decorative painting. But we know that they were in the same circles very much. But Frances starts to see her family slowly become embroiled in the politics of the time. Thomas, of course, in 1765 with the Stamp Act. Frances's life gets increasingly more strained and difficult due to family tragedies, differing views. Initially, her father is very supportive of earlier action. We know the Gores are supportive of the non-importation agreements. He and his son, John Jr., and Thomas Crafts all attended the celebration dinner at Liberty Tree on August 14th, 1769, to celebrate the first anniversary of the repeal of the Stamp Act. Then we have that spinning bee in 1770.
Yeah.
We know that Frances and her sisters are most likely there. It's a public spectacle to show how the ladies can help. And we actually do know that Frances was an accomplished embroiderer. I got to visit Gore Place in Waltham, which was built for her brother Christopher, who's a younger brother who eventually becomes a Massachusetts governor in his later life. But one of the things I got to see was an embroidered Gore family crest that was given to him as a gift from his sisters. And I did ask, and they said it was most likely the older sisters who worked on that. So probably Frances. So
Wow.
possibly got to see something that she worked on herself, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
What the article doesn't say, the article about the spinning bee, though, is that the Gore family were also dealing with some other things during that time. Samuel Gore, her brother, was involved in the shooting of Christopher Sider, who's an 11-year-old boy who was killed during a tax riot. And this happened just 4 days before the publishing of that article on the spinning bee. So around the same time that Frances and her sisters are letting their voices be heard, contributing to the Patriot cause, Sammy's over there getting involved in a riot, who she most likely helped raise. He was shot in both thighs and his right forehand. Dr. Warren luckily didn't have to amputate, but he lost function in that hand. Not very good for a painter. So I am very cognizant of just how hard Frances's life was, not for money or finances, because it's important for us to remember that she's upper crust of Boston. She's an upper crust white lady from a financially sound family. But in having to uphold all that societal pressure as both a representative of the Gore family and the Crafts household. I mean, she marries Thomas right before the Stamp Act riots. We see all that unrest. Thomas is even labeled as a Tory for decrying the violence for some time. Sees her own father and brother, dealing with those rumor mill sort of things during the non-importation agreements, defending themselves in the newspaper. Her brother is shot during that riot. In early 1771, actually, as we know, shortly after that shooting, the Boston Massacre happens, and Thomas is a coroner during that. He testifies at the trial. And then early 1771, her brother, John Gore Jr., dies of an apoplectic fit, which we know now is a brain aneurysm, a sudden hemorrhage. So we see this family just go through turmoil, involvement in the destruction of the tea. Both her brother and her husband are there. Sides are drawn after that. John Gore Sr., who seemingly cannot take any more, actually switches sides. And in 1774, he's one of the merchants that signs a letter to damn the actions of the destruction of the tea, pledges loyalty to the crown, and separate himself from his family. And we know that on Evacuation Day in 1776, he leaves for Nova Scotia with Boston loyalists and eventually makes his way to London, leaving most of his family behind. So, she has her husband involved in the Tea Party, her brother involved in the Tea Party. She's got 3 toddlers at home. And so Frances, for me, is sort of that story of nevertheless she persisted, because the pressure she had to deal with all of that, and then seeing the aftermath, seeing the Port of Boston close, her husband having to stay behind and assess those damages and help with that. And then to put the final sort of nail in the coffin, so to speak, their 4th child is born and baptized on February 26, 1775, which is the very same day that an almost skirmish happens in Salem over stolen weaponry, that we now know as Leslie's Retreat. So, just her family being so embroiled in that, and her having to sort of be responsible for cleaning up the messes of all the men in her life constantly, and just sort of being that eldest child and being involved is one of the very ways that we are privileged to be able to tell these stories at the museum, and to tell the stories of women who you never really get to hear about unless you're looking for it. So it's really great to do this tea talk and talk about Sarah Bradley Fulton and Frances. It's great.
It is, yeah. And, like you said, we do have a great privilege and honor to be able to bring these people back to life, on a daily basis here at the museum. And even if we can't find a lot of actual primary source material about them, even just to bring their names up, to be able to speak their names and to tell some sort of a story, I think is really great. So wow, like we covered a lot tonight. So I think maybe at this point we should take some questions. So to our viewers here, down at the bottom of your screen, you will see the Q&A. If you want to go ahead and put any questions in there. Looks like Linda Hoover already jumped in here. All right. Does any roster of Daughters of Liberty exist? My sixth great-great-grandmother was Mehitable Wheeler Crane. Oh my goodness. And I would love to know her involvement in the cause. Wow. Like, that's fantastic. So Linda, number one, you should email us your information so we can, maybe chat with you a little bit more. I don't believe that there's any specific roster that is out there.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think there's a roster, but we know that Mehitable Wheeler Crane, we actually know that she, John later serves in the war. He ends up in Rhode Island, I believe, at one point, and I believe that Mehitable follows him for a while. She actually she writes to him, we know, but we know she actually goes and joins him at some point. So I would say in that way, she's definitely involved in supporting John and watching him sort of be involved in the revolution, very much so. And we know that, of course, it was their 7th wedding anniversary when the tea was destroyed. So I would say Mehitable is very involved if we're even just looking at that.
Very nice. Yeah, that's great. Oh, and look at that in the chat, somebody else, a Molyneux, apparently kin to William Molyneux. Man, we've got the whole family here tonight. This is amazing. All right, so are there any other questions? There's, huzzah to you too, Cam. Thanks for joining us.
Actually, speaking of Molyneux, we have somebody on site who, for a very long time, portrayed Mary Anne Janou Molyneux, William Molyneux's wife.
That's right.
Who's, very upper crust herself. So
upper crust, but the wife of a rabble rouser for sure. And I often wonder how she dealt with that. And soon we will have Elizabeth McIntosh joining our roster here of characters on site. And Ebenezer McIntosh was the leader of the South End Gang. And so he was different because he was a much poorer man than Molyneux. And so, kind of then putting Elizabeth and Marianne, they're very similar situations where they're dealing with their husbands who are leaders in this cause and leaders in the violence of this cause. And did they know about it? Were they happy that it was happening, or were they just kind of, maybe turning a blind eye while all of this was going on? So, it'll be really interesting to watch them, coming out later. So great. Let's see. Anne says she enjoyed herself, and thank you for a great talk. Thanks, Anne. Yeah, but like we said at the beginning. Oh, hi, Mom. Like we said at the beginning, there is so much material to cover. In this wider swath of women in the American Revolution, because a lot of times the stuff that's written down is, obviously focusing on the men that were taking part in these battles and all of that sort of thing. But there are a lot of stories that are untold. But, we can continue to try to tell as many as we can. It's great for us to unearth some of these people and to find these really, interesting anecdotes, even if it's just one little anecdote. These are, I think what's also hard for us sometimes is these names in textbooks, right? We've put these people on these pedestals a lot of times for so, so long, forgetting that they are real people, just like us, flawed individuals, just like us, that are dealing with, you know, happiness, heartbreak, love, loss, everything in between. And all they really want is to take care of their families, build a better community, you know, and to build a better future for themselves. And I think that's one way that we can really relate to the people of the 18th century, you know, and bring just a little bit more humanity into our history. Um,
And I think too,
so,
for me, a little humanity for Frances. I mentioned earlier that she died very young.
mm-hmm,
Um, so Thomas outlived her by 11 years, and we know that they were a love match from other accounts. We know that John Adams was a frequent visitor to their home, especially after the war. And we know that Thomas never married again when Frances passes away, which is sort of uncommon.
yeah,
Um, Especially because he is not that much older than her. He's only 5 years older than her. So for a man of 49 in the 18th century to never marry again in 11 years.
wow.
Yeah, so that humanizes it even a little more. And I mean, I can only imagine that them going through that together and going through all of that had a huge impact on that family.
Yeah,
So it's so to sort of humanize them a little bit more.
yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah, because I think Sarah may have actually been widowed for like 30 years or
mm,
something, you know, like a long time. Like John passed away. And I mean, of course, you never expect anyone to live to like 94 in the colonial era. So there's that. Let's see. Oh, did any of the women have trouble with British authorities concerning their involvement in the cause? That's a good question.
that is a good question.
Yeah.
Well, I know that was it Sarah Bradley Fulton? I remember somebody like a redcoat came like knocking on the door after the destruction of the tea.
Yeah, so that's part of the family lore where they say that when John Fulton and the four brothers all came back to Nathaniel's house, that you know they washed them up and basically like shoved them all into bed. You know, like they're probably
Okay.
still fully dressed, just like with the blankets pulled up, and that there was the possibility of a redcoat walking by. Now, we also don't know the truth of that matter because one thing that we always talk about is how the night of the Boston Tea Party, the Redcoats were not around, that they were mostly out at Castle William and things like that. And so you kind of try to decide, like, was that real? Or, I mean, it could have been any loyalist really at that point. Like it could have been anyone just trying to figure out what was going on, because the secretive nature of this event, people were trying to keep the information, you know, as hush hush as possible because they were committing treason.
Right.
And we all know what happens if you get caught committing treason.
Right.
Yes, you're hanged for treason. So not good.
Yeah, not a good
Not a good look.
we have
Let's
another
see. Oh, and can you give the full name of Frances again? Kelly out here in webinar land would love to look her up some more.
Yes. Oh my
Yay.
goodness. I guess I love talking about Frances, but it's Frances Gore Crafts. So Gore and Crafts. So Frances Gore Crafts, and a good resource if you're just looking for a little more Gore family history is actually the book. I actually have it right next to me. The Road to Concord by J.L. Bell. There's a lot of Gore family history in there.
Nice.
I'm hoping to find more on Frances in particular, just because it seemed like a lot of her history, like many of the women we come across, is sort of centered around the men in her life, which I would like to rectify myself someday. So
Absolutely. All right. Well, whew, I mean, now before we say goodnight tonight, I'm gonna go ahead and let me see here, share my screen real quick. Let me see here. All right. And of course, if you are interested in learning more about the Boston Tea Party, join us next month, of course. I want you to, you know, of course, follow us on all of your social media channels. They're all listed up here. Visit our website to get more info. We've got, you know, tons of research materials on there. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. You know, stuff going out, you know, pretty often. And then next month's Tea Talk will be the myths of the Boston Tea Party. So there we are using, right there, the myths, the truths, the untold stories. So we're getting to the myths finally. I know some of you have been really waiting for that. So hopefully you'll join us on Wednesday, April 28th at 7 p.m. And so to register or learn more, go to virtual.bostonteapartyship.com. Now, calling all teachers. Yes, did you know that we offer virtual field trips? And so whether you are in the classroom, a hybrid model, or fully virtual, we can help with our Boston Tea Party and Boston Massacre presentations. We are so grateful and thankful and just sending all of our good feelings and love to the teachers out there who have had such a hard time of it this last year. And we hope that a visit with us has helped in any way possible. Of course, if you're looking for some unique gifts, bring the Boston Tea Party home with you. Shop.bostonteapartyship.com. Lots of cool stuff, tons of tea, of course, if you're looking for tea, or come down and visit us. We are open beginning April 1st. We are open Thursday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. for our mostly outdoor self-guided experience. And the gift shop is open during those times as well. Or you could even come into Abigail's Tea Room and have a cup of tea. You can come in and try the 5 teas that were thrown overboard during the Boston Tea Party. So lots of stuff to do here. We do hope to see you soon. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Kristen, thank you for joining me tonight. This was fantastic. I had such a great time.
I did too.
Yeah, this was awesome. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a great night.